Before there were cities, before there were laws, before humans dreamed of touching the sky, there was Babylon, the place where civilization took its first breath. Tonight, we'll explore how a handful of settlements between two rivers became the birthplace of written law, urban planning, and architectural wonders that defied both gravity and divine anger. Let the warmth of the fire embrace you as we journey to humanity's first great experiment in living together. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Tonight, you're safe, warm, and about to witness the birth of everything we call civilization. Let your mind drift back through time, past medieval castles, past Egyptian pyramids, past the earliest Greek temples, all the way back to a place between two rivers where mud became majesty and ambition touched the heavens. The Mesopotamian dawn broke slowly over the marshlands, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples that reflected in the countless waterways threading through the landscape. This was Babylonia, circa 2000 BCE, and if you had stood on any small hill in this region, you would have seen something remarkable. The birth of urban civilization itself. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers wasn't paradise. It was hot, marshy, and prone to devastating floods. But it had something precious, incredibly fertile soil deposited by centuries of river flooding. The early Babylonians didn't fight the floods. They learned to work with them, creating the world's first sophisticated irrigation systems. Picture walking through one of these early settlements at sunrise. The air is thick with humidity and the scent of baking bread. Clay ovens smoke gently outside mud brick homes. Children splash in irrigation channels, their laughter mixing with the calls of merchants already setting up for the day's trade. This isn't the primitive village you might imagine. This is a complex society with specialists, administrators, and engineers. The houses themselves tell a story of ingenuity. Built from mud bricks that were sun-dried and then sometimes fired in kilns, these structures could last for decades. The bricks were mixed with straw and bitumen, a natural tar that seeped from the ground, making them waterproof. Every home had a courtyard to capture rainwater, and most had sophisticated drainage systems that would impress modern urban planners. As you walk through these streets, notice how organized everything is. This isn't random settlement, it's planned community. Wide main roads run north-south and east-west, creating a grid system that would later influence city planning for millennia. Side streets branch off at right angles, leading to residential quarters where families have lived for generations. The people you pass are diverse, speaking various languages and dialects, but united by trade and mutual necessity. There are Sumerians, whose writing system forms the backbone of administration. There are Akkadians, whose language is becoming the diplomatic tongue of the region. There are nomadic tribes who have settled here, bringing new techniques for metalworking and animal husbandry. But what's truly remarkable is the scale of cooperation required to make this work. Thousands of people living together, sharing resources, following common laws, building together towards something greater than any individual could achieve alone. This is humanity's first real experiment with urban civilization, and it's happening right here, right now, in ancient Babylonia. The morning routine of these ancient urbanites would be familiar to any city dweller today. Families wake before dawn to avoid the worst heat of the day. Fathers head to workshops, fields, or administrative offices. Mothers organise household activities that often include small-scale manufacturing, textile production, food preparation, or craft production that contributes to the family's income. Children have responsibilities too, but they also have time for play and learning. The fortunate ones from merchant or administrative families attend schools where they learn reading, writing, and mathematics. Others learn trades through apprenticeships or family businesses. But all children in Babylon grow up understanding that they are part of something larger than their individual families. They are citizens of the world's first great city. The social structure is complex, but not rigidly hierarchical. While there are clear distinctions between rulers and ruled, free citizens and slaves, rich and poor, there is also considerable social mobility. Successful merchants can rise to positions of influence. Skilled craftsmen are respected regardless of their birth. Even slaves can sometimes earn or buy their freedom and establish successful businesses. Trade is the lifeblood of this early urban economy. Even in these early settlements, archaeologists have found goods from hundreds of miles away, precious stones from Iran, copper from Anatolia, shells from the Persian Gulf. This isn't just occasional contact. It's systematic trade that requires organization, standardization, and trust between communities that may never have met face to face. The standardization itself is remarkable. Weights and measures are consistent across vast distances. Quality standards for goods are maintained through guild systems. Payment methods, primarily barley and silver, are accepted throughout the region. Someone in northern Mesopotamia can do business with someone from the southern marshes using common standards and expectations. Religion permeates daily life, but not in the oppressive way we might imagine. The gods are seen as partners in human endeavors rather than distant rulers. Temples aren't just places of worship. They're economic centers, educational institutions, and community gathering places. The priests aren't a separate caste. They're often also administrators, teachers, and technical experts. The temple complexes themselves are marvels of organization and efficiency. They maintain vast storehouses of grain and other goods, serving as both religious centers and economic institutions. Temple priests keep detailed records of transactions, serving as the world's first banks. They also maintain schools, libraries, and workshops where knowledge is preserved and transmitted. But perhaps most remarkably, these early Babylonians are developing concepts that will shape human civilization for millennia. The idea that society should be governed by law rather than arbitrary power, that knowledge should be preserved and transmitted systematically, that human beings can improve their condition through cooperation and innovation. The evidence for this cultural revolution is written in clay. Thousands of tablets that record everything from business transactions to astronomical observations to literary works. These aren't just administrative records. They're the foundation of human literacy, the first systematic attempt to preserve knowledge in written form. Let's pause for a moment and truly appreciate what these ancient engineers accomplished with nothing but human hands, basic tools, and brilliant minds. The irrigation system alone was a masterpiece that kept an entire civilization fed and watered for over 1,000 years. Imagine the challenge. 2 massive rivers that flood unpredictably, depositing both life-giving silt and destructive torrents. The Babylonians developed a network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs that could channel this power precisely where it was needed. The main canals were engineering marvels, some over 100 miles long, carefully graded to maintain proper water flow without erosion. But it wasn't just about moving water. They created lock systems to raise and lower boats between different water levels. They built aqueducts to carry water over low-lying areas. They constructed spillways to prevent catastrophic flooding. All of this required precise mathematical calculations, coordinated labor, and long-term planning that spanned generations. The workers who built these systems weren't slaves, despite what Hollywood might have taught you. They were skilled craftsmen, engineers, and laborers who took pride in their work. Archaeological evidence shows they were well-fed, properly housed, and even had healthcare systems. Many of the canal builders left inscriptions marking their work, signing their names to engineering projects they knew would outlast their lifetimes. The construction process itself was a marvel of organization. Teams of workers would arrive at dawn, carrying bronze tools, measuring devices, and detailed plans written on clay tablets. The project supervisors could read and write, Literacy was widespread among the administrative class, and they kept meticulous records of materials, labour and progress. Picture a typical day on one of these construction sites. The sun rises over hundreds of workers dividing into specialised teams. Some dig and shape the canal bed using wooden shovels and bronze picks. Others prepare and place the stone lining that will prevent erosion. Still others work on the wooden gates and bronze fittings that will control water flow. There's a rhythm to the work, almost musical. The sound of picks hitting earth, the splash of water being diverted, the calls of supervisors checking measurements with their calibrated ropes and poles. It's coordinated labour on a scale humanity had never attempted before, and it's working. But the real genius wasn't just in the construction, it was in the maintenance. The Babylonians created the world's first bureaucratic system specifically to maintain these waterworks. Records from the period show detailed schedules for dredging sediment, repairing gates, and reinforcing canal walls. They even had emergency protocols for dealing with unexpected floods or droughts. The mathematical sophistication required for these projects was extraordinary. Babylonian engineers had to calculate water flow rates, structural loads, and excavation volumes using only simple tools and early mathematical techniques. They developed trigonometric methods for surveying that wouldn't be improved upon for over 1,000 years. The social organisation required was equally impressive. These projects involve coordinating the labour of thousands of workers over periods of years or even decades. This required not just engineering skills, but administrative capabilities, organising food and housing for workers, maintaining quality control over construction, coordinating with suppliers of materials and tools. The economic implications were staggering. A single major canal project might involve the equivalent economic output of an entire region for several years. This required sophisticated financial planning, risk assessment, and resource allocation. The Babylonians developed some of the world's first cost-benefit analysis techniques to determine which projects were worth undertaking. The canals themselves were just the beginning. The Babylonians also built sophisticated urban drainage systems, preventing the buildup of sewage and stagnant water that could spread disease. They created flood control systems that could protect populated areas during extreme weather events. They even built recreational water features, gardens and pools that served no practical purpose except to beautify urban spaces. The materials science involved was remarkably advanced. The Babylonians experimented with different mixtures of clay, straw, and bitumen to create bricks that were waterproof, durable, and suitable for different construction purposes. They developed mortar recipes that could set underwater. They created metal alloys that were resistant to corrosion in wet environments. The surveying techniques they developed for canal construction were also applied to urban planning, agricultural field layout, and architectural projects. The Babylonians were among the first people to create accurate maps and scale drawings, essential tools for any complex construction project. But perhaps most importantly, they understood that infrastructure was the foundation of civilization. They invested enormous resources in public works projects that benefited the entire community rather than just elite individuals. This concept that government should build things that serve the common good was revolutionary and remains fundamental to modern ideas about public policy. The legacy of these engineering achievements extends far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The techniques developed by Babylonian engineers were copied and adapted throughout the ancient world. Roman aqueducts, Chinese canals, and medieval European waterworks all drew on principles first established by these ancient masters of hydraulic engineering. While the engineers were reshaping the landscape, another group of innovators was reshaping human society itself. Around 1750 BCE, King Hammurabi commissioned what would become history's most famous legal code, a set of laws that attempted to govern every aspect of human interaction in these growing cities. The Code of Hammurabi wasn't just a list of rules. It was a revolutionary attempt to create justice through written law, rather than arbitrary royal decree. Picture the great stone stele being erected in the center of Babylon, covered with wedge-shaped cuneiform writing that any literate citizen could read and understand. The laws themselves reveal a sophisticated understanding of human nature and social organization. There were regulations for trade, family relationships, property rights, and criminal justice. But more importantly, they established the principle that justice should be predictable and consistent. The same crime should receive the same punishment, regardless of who committed it. Walk through ancient Babylon during Hammurabi's time, and you'll see these laws in action. In the marketplace, merchants conduct business knowing exactly what contracts are enforceable and what remedies exist for fraud. In residential areas, neighbors settle disputes according to known legal principles rather than violence or favoritism. The court system itself was remarkably advanced. There were local judges for minor disputes, regional courts for more serious matters, and appeals processes for important cases. Evidence was carefully evaluated, witnesses were sworn to truthfulness, and written records were kept of all proceedings. But perhaps most revolutionary was the idea of proportional justice, that punishments should fit crimes. While some of Hammurabi's specific penalties seem harsh to modern sensibilities, the underlying principle was groundbreaking. Legal systems should be rational, predictable, and fair. The scribes who recorded these laws were members of a growing intellectual class that included not only legal experts but also mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers. They developed standardized systems of weights and measures, created sophisticated accounting methods, and even established the world's first known schools. These schools taught reading, writing, mathematics, and law to the children of merchants, administrators, and craftsmen. Education wasn't reserved for royalty. It was seen as essential for maintaining the complex society they were building. Graduates of these schools went on to become the engineers, judges, merchants, and administrators who kept Babylonian civilization running smoothly. The legal principles established by Hammurabi influenced legal systems throughout the ancient world and continue to shape modern law today. The concept of written law that applies equally to all citizens. The idea that evidence should be carefully evaluated before reaching judgments. The principle that punishments should be proportionate to crimes. All of these fundamental concepts of modern justice systems can be traced back to ancient Babylon. But the Code of Hammurabi was more than just a legal document. It was a social contract that attempted to balance the needs of different groups within Babylonian society. The laws protected the weak against exploitation by the strong, established fair wages and working conditions, and created mechanisms for resolving conflicts without violence. The code also reveals much about daily life in ancient Babylon. There were laws governing marriage and divorce, adoption and inheritance, business partnerships and employment contracts. There were regulations for builders, doctors, and other professionals, establishing standards of competence and accountability. There were even early consumer protection laws, ensuring that goods sold in the marketplace met certain quality standards, and the enforcement of these laws required a sophisticated administrative system. There were court officials, investigators, and enforcers. There were procedures for collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and documenting proceedings. There were mechanisms for ensuring that judgments were carried out fairly and consistently. The influence of Babylonian law extended far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. Traveling merchants carried legal concepts and practices to distant lands. Diplomatic relations spread Babylonian legal innovations to neighboring kingdoms. Conquered peoples often retained elements of Babylonian law, even under foreign rule. Perhaps most importantly, the Babylonians established the principle that law should be based on reason rather than arbitrary power. This concept that government should be limited by law rather than operating according to the whims of rulers was revolutionary. and remains fundamental to modern democratic societies. The preservation of legal knowledge was also revolutionary. The Babylonians created comprehensive legal libraries where statutes, court decisions, and legal commentaries were systematically collected and preserved. This allowed legal knowledge to accumulate over time, rather than being lost when individual rulers or judges died. The training of legal professionals was equally systematic. Young men who wanted to become judges or legal administrators underwent years of education that included not only memorizing laws, but also studying the reasoning behind them and practicing their application to complex cases. The Babylonian legal system also included what we would recognize as constitutional principles, limits on governmental power, protection of individual rights, and mechanisms for peaceful transfer of authority. While these concepts weren't as fully developed as in modern democratic systems, their presence in ancient Babylon shows that the ideas underlying constitutional government have very deep historical roots. Now comes the most audacious part of our story, the moment when Babylonians decided to build structures that would literally reach toward the heavens. The ziggurats of Babylon weren't just buildings. They were statements of human ambition, engineering prowess, and spiritual devotion, all rolled into massive brick monuments. The Tower of Babel, as it came to be known in biblical tradition, was likely the great ziggurat of Marduk in Babylon proper, called Etemenanki, which means foundation of heaven and earth. This structure rose nearly 300 feet above the Mesopotamian plain, making it visible for miles in every direction. Imagine approaching this marvel as a traveller from a distant land. Long before you reach the city walls, you see it on the horizon. A massive step pyramid that seems to connect the earth to the sky itself. As you draw closer, the sheer scale becomes overwhelming. The base covers an area equivalent to several city blocks, and the structure rises in 7 distinct stages, each one smaller than the last, creating a stairway to the heavens. But this wasn't built by magic or divine intervention. It was constructed by human hands using brilliant engineering and backbreaking labor. The foundation alone required millions of mud bricks, each one individually made, dried, and carefully placed. The bricks were bound with bitumen, that natural tar we mentioned earlier, creating a waterproof, earthquake-resistant structure that could support enormous weight. The construction process would have taken decades and involved thousands of workers. Picture the building site, ramps spiraling around the growing structure, allowing workers to carry bricks and materials to ever higher levels. Teams of oxen hauling massive stone blocks for the foundation. Skilled bricklayers working with precision to ensure each level was perfectly aligned. The logistics alone were staggering. Someone had to organize the production of millions of bricks, ensuring a steady supply of clay, straw, and bitumen. Someone had to coordinate the work of thousands of laborers, from unskilled brick carriers to master architects. Someone had to solve the engineering challenges of building stable structures at unprecedented heights. The workers themselves came from all levels of society. Archaeological evidence suggests that while some were paid laborers, others were contributing as part of their civic duty or religious obligation. Building the ziggurat was seen as a community effort, a way for the entire civilization to participate in creating something greater than any individual could achieve. As each level was completed, it would be carefully surveyed and measured to ensure the next level could be built safely. The Babylonians had developed sophisticated techniques for calculating load-bearing capacity, structural stability, and wind resistance. They understood that building tall required not just strength, but precise engineering. The finished ziggurat was more than just an impressive structure. It was a functional religious complex. The top level housed a shrine to Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. The intermediate levels contained chambers for priests, storage for religious artifacts, and spaces for ritual ceremonies. But the ziggurat also served practical purposes. Its height made it an excellent observation post for watching the surrounding countryside. Its mass provided a stable foundation that could withstand floods, earthquakes, and enemy attacks. And its visibility made it a landmark that helped travelers navigate the flat Mesopotamian landscape. The architectural techniques developed for ziggurat construction influenced building throughout the ancient world. The use of stepped levels to distribute weight, the incorporation of ramps and internal passages, the methods for creating stable foundations on soft soil, all of these innovations were copied and adapted by later civilizations. The decorative elements of the ziggurats were equally impressive. The upper levels were often covered with glazed bricks in brilliant colours: blue, green, yellow, and red. These colours weren't just decorative. They had religious and astronomical significance, representing different gods and celestial phenomena. The astronomical alignments of the ziggurats reveal the sophisticated mathematical knowledge of their builders. The structures were precisely oriented to cardinal directions and often aligned with important stellar or solar events. This required not only advanced surveying techniques, but also detailed astronomical observations. The maintenance of these massive structures was itself a major undertaking. The Babylonians developed sophisticated systems for repairing and renovating ziggurats, ensuring that they remained stable and functional for centuries. This required ongoing investment of resources and technical expertise that demonstrates the long-term planning capabilities of Babylonian society. The symbolic significance of the ziggurats extended far beyond their religious functions. They represented the power and prestige of the cities that built them, serving as monuments to human achievement and civic pride. The ability to construct such massive projects demonstrated a community's organizational capabilities, technical expertise, and economic resources. The influence of ziggurat architecture can be seen in monumental buildings throughout history, from Egyptian pyramids to Greek temples to modern skyscrapers. The basic principles, using a series of steps or levels to achieve height while maintaining stability, incorporating both functional and symbolic elements in design, creating structures that serve as landmarks and gathering places, remain fundamental to architectural practice today. Let's step down from these monumental achievements and walk through the daily life of ordinary Babylonians. Because while the ziggurats and canals were impressive, the real miracle of Babylon was that thousands of people figured out how to live together peacefully in humanity's first true urban environment. Your day in ancient Babylon begins before sunrise. The heat of Mesopotamia makes early morning the most pleasant time for work, so the city starts stirring while the stars are still visible. From your home, likely a 2-story mud brick house built around a central courtyard, you can hear the sounds of your neighbours beginning their day. The house itself is a marvel of practical design. The thick walls provide insulation against the heat, while the central courtyard creates natural air circulation. Rooms are arranged around the courtyard, with the ground floor used for storage and workshops, and the upper floor reserved for sleeping and private family life. Your family doesn't live alone in this house. Extended families often shared these spaces, with grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes even married siblings all under one roof. This wasn't just economic necessity, it was the foundation of Babylonian social structure. The household was the basic unit of society, and larger households were generally more successful and influential. As the sun rises, you might join your neighbours at the neighbourhood bakery. Bread was a staple food, but individual families didn't usually bake their own. Instead, community ovens served entire neighbourhoods, with families bringing their prepared dough to be baked by professional bakers. This system was efficient, social, and reduced the fire hazard of having ovens in every home. The streets are already busy with merchants setting up their stalls. The marketplace isn't just about commerce, it's the social heart of the community. Here you'll encounter people from dozens of different backgrounds: local farmers bringing fresh produce, travelling merchants with exotic goods from distant lands, craftsmen selling pottery and metalwork, and professional scribes offering to write letters for those who can't read. The diversity is remarkable. Babylon was one of history's first truly cosmopolitan cities, attracting people from across the known world. You might hear a dozen different languages in a morning walk through the market, but somehow it all works. Trade languages and standardized measures allow people to communicate and do business despite their different backgrounds. If you're a craftsman, perhaps a potter or metal worker, your day involves both individual skill and community cooperation. Raw materials come through the trade networks that connect Babylon to the wider world. Techniques and designs are shared within guilds that regulate quality and train apprentices. And finished goods are sold not just locally, but exported throughout the known world. The guild system itself was revolutionary. These weren't just economic organizations. They were social support networks that provided healthcare, settled disputes, cared for widows and orphans, and maintained professional standards. Being a member of a guild meant you were part of a community within the larger community of the city. If you're a farmer living in Babylon, your life revolves around the seasonal rhythms of the irrigation system. During planting season, you work closely with your neighbors to ensure proper water distribution. During harvest, the entire community cooperates to bring in crops before the autumn floods. And during the flood season, you might work on construction projects in the city, contributing to the ongoing expansion and improvement of urban infrastructure. Women in Babylonian society had rights and responsibilities that would seem progressive even by modern standards. They could own property, conduct business, serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, and even become priestesses with significant social influence. Marriage was typically arranged, but wives had legal protections against abuse and could initiate divorce under certain circumstances. Children's lives were focused on learning the skills they would need as adults. Boys from merchant families might attend schools to learn reading, writing, and mathematics. Girls learned household management, textile production, and often some literacy. But all children contributed to family economic activities from an early age, whether helping in workshops, assisting with farming, or caring for younger siblings. The education system was remarkably sophisticated. Schools weren't just for children. Adults could also attend classes to learn new skills or improve their literacy. The curriculum included not only practical subjects like mathematics and writing, but also literature, history, and science. Teachers were respected members of society, often priests or scribes, who combined education with other professional responsibilities. Healthcare in ancient Babylon was surprisingly advanced. There were professional physicians who understood anatomy, could perform surgery, and prescribed medicines based on empirical observation. Medical knowledge was systematically recorded and transmitted through professional training programs. There were even specialists, eye doctors, surgeons, and experts in different types of diseases. The legal system affected daily life in countless ways. Contracts for everything from business partnerships to marriage were written down and legally enforceable. Disputes could be settled in courts rather than through violence. Property rights were protected, and there were legal remedies for fraud, theft, and other crimes. Entertainment and culture were important parts of daily life. There were festivals, musical performances, storytelling events, and athletic competitions. The wealthy patronized artists and musicians, but cultural events were often public and accessible to all social classes. Religion wasn't separate from daily life. It was integrated into work, family relationships, and community activities. The rhythm of daily life was structured but not rigid. People worked hard, but there were also times for rest, celebration, and community gathering. The balance between individual achievement and community cooperation that characterized Babylonian society created an environment where people could pursue personal goals while contributing to the common good. But paradise between two rivers came with a price. The constant threat of devastating floods that could wipe away years of careful construction in a matter of days. The Babylonians' greatest engineering challenge wasn't building monuments to the gods. It was learning to survive the gods' periodic attempts to reclaim the land. The floods came with terrifying regularity, usually in late spring, when mountain snowmelt combined with seasonal rains to turn the Tigris and Euphrates into raging torrents. These weren't gentle overflows. They were wall-to-wall disasters that could change the course of rivers, destroy entire settlements, and drown thousands of people and animals. Archaeological evidence shows that Babylon was severely flooded at least once every generation and completely devastated roughly once every century. Yet somehow, the civilization not only survived these disasters, but grew stronger after each one. How did they do it? The answer lies in their remarkable combination of engineering, social organization, and cultural adaptation. First, they learned to read the signs. Babylonian astronomers and engineers developed sophisticated methods for predicting floods based on seasonal patterns, rainfall measurements, and river levels. They couldn't prevent floods, but they could often see them coming weeks in advance. When flood warnings came, the entire society shifted into emergency mode. Granaries were moved to higher ground. Livestock were driven to elevated areas. Boats were prepared for evacuation and rescue operations. Most importantly, detailed records were made of property ownership, stored in waterproof containers, so that communities could be rebuilt fairly after the waters receded. The buildings themselves were designed with floods in mind. Houses had storage areas on upper floors where families could wait out rising waters. Important documents were kept in sealed clay containers. Foundations were built with drainage systems that could handle temporary flooding without structural damage. But perhaps most impressively, the Babylonians developed what we might call disaster capitalism. Economic systems that could function even during and after catastrophic floods. Merchants maintained emergency stockpiles of food, tools, and building materials. Craftsmen specialized in rapid reconstruction techniques, and the legal system included provisions for renegotiating debts and contracts when natural disasters made original agreements impossible to fulfill. The flood stories that appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh and later in biblical tradition weren't just mythology. They were cultural memory of real disasters that these people had survived through cooperation, preparation, and sheer determination. The story of Noah's Ark makes much more sense when you understand that flood survival was a regular part of life for anyone living in Mesopotamia. After each major flood, Babylon didn't just rebuild, it improved. Engineers analyzed what had worked and what had failed. New techniques were developed for flood-resistant construction. The canal system was expanded and strengthened, and the social systems that had enabled survival were reinforced and celebrated. This created a culture that was remarkably resilient and adaptive. Babylonians didn't see disasters as evidence of divine anger or random bad luck. They saw them as challenges to be met with human intelligence and cooperation. This attitude permeated their entire approach to life, making them innovators and problem solvers in ways that gave them advantages over neighboring civilizations. The engineering solutions they developed for flood control influenced water management throughout the ancient world. The concept of coordinated regional flood control, the use of overflow channels and retention basins, the development of early warning systems. All of these innovations were first pioneered in ancient Mesopotamia and later adopted by civilizations around the world. But the social innovations were equally important. The Babylonians developed sophisticated systems for disaster relief, community mutual aid, and post-disaster reconstruction. They understood that surviving natural disasters required not just individual preparation, but coordinated community response. The economic strategies they developed for dealing with disasters were particularly advanced. They created what we would recognize as insurance systems, where communities pooled resources to help members recover from losses. They developed flexible credit systems, that could accommodate the disruptions caused by natural disasters. They even created early forms of government disaster relief, where public resources were used to help communities recover from major catastrophes. The psychological and cultural adaptations were perhaps most remarkable of all. The Babylonians developed a worldview that accepted uncertainty and change as natural parts of life, while maintaining optimism about human capabilities. They believed that while individuals couldn't control natural forces, communities working together could survive and even thrive despite periodic disasters. This combination of practical preparation, technological innovation, social cooperation, and cultural resilience made Babylonian civilization remarkably durable. While other ancient civilizations were often destroyed by natural disasters, the Babylonians repeatedly survived catastrophes that should have ended their civilization. The lessons they learned about disaster preparedness and community resilience remain relevant today. Their understanding that natural disasters are predictable events that can be prepared for, that communities must work together to survive major catastrophes, and that rebuilding after disasters provides opportunities for improvement. All of these insights continue to influence modern approaches to disaster management. While farmers planted and engineers built, another group of Babylonians was engaged in perhaps the most ambitious project of all, trying to understand the universe itself. The Babylonian astronomers and mathematicians made discoveries that formed the foundation of science for the next 2,000 years. Picture the rooftop of a Babylonian ziggurat on a clear night. Here, priest astronomers spend their evenings carefully observing and recording the movements of stars, planets, and celestial phenomena. They're not just stargazing, they're conducting the world's first systematic scientific observations, creating records that will be consulted by scholars for millennia. The Babylonians identified and named most of the constellations we still recognize today. They tracked the movements of planets with such precision that their calculations were more accurate than anything achieved in Europe until the Renaissance. They predicted eclipses, tracked the cycles of Venus, and developed the mathematical techniques that would later be used by Greek astronomers. But their interests went far beyond pure astronomy. They were the first to develop the mathematical concept of zero, a revolutionary idea that made advanced calculations possible. They created the sexagesimal system, base 60, that we still use for measuring time and angles. They figured out how to calculate the areas of complex geometric shapes and solve quadratic equations. The scribal schools where this knowledge was preserved and transmitted were remarkable institutions. Students spent years learning not just to read and write, but to master complex mathematical and astronomical calculations. They copied and recopied ancient texts, ensuring that knowledge accumulated over generations rather than being lost when individual scholars died. These weren't just technical training centers. They were genuine intellectual communities where scholars debated theories, tested hypotheses, and developed new ideas. Archaeological excavations have uncovered libraries containing thousands of clay tablets, covering subjects from mathematics and astronomy to medicine, literature, and philosophy. The medical knowledge preserved in these libraries was particularly advanced. Babylonian physicians understood anatomy, could perform complex surgeries, and had developed pharmaceutical treatments for dozens of diseases. They kept detailed case records, allowing them to track which treatments worked and which didn't. This empirical approach to medicine was remarkably modern in its methodology, but perhaps most remarkable was their historical consciousness. Babylonian scribes maintained chronicles that recorded important events, political changes, astronomical observations, and natural disasters spanning hundreds of years. They understood that knowledge accumulated over time, and that future generations could build on the work of their predecessors. This long-term perspective influenced everything about Babylonian civilization. They built for permanence, planned for the future, and took seriously their responsibility to preserve and transmit knowledge. This wasn't just intellectual curiosity, it was a foundational cultural value that saw learning and knowledge as essential to human flourishing. The mathematical innovations developed by Babylonian scholars were particularly influential. Their work on algebraic equations, geometric calculations, and numerical systems provided the foundation for later Greek and Islamic mathematics. Many of the mathematical techniques we use today can be traced directly back to Babylonian innovations. The astronomical observations made by Babylonian scholars were equally important. Their careful tracking of planetary movements provided the data that later astronomers used to develop theories about the structure of the solar system. Their predictions of eclipses and other celestial events demonstrated that natural phenomena followed predictable patterns rather than being random acts of the gods. The preservation and transmission of knowledge was itself a major intellectual achievement. The Babylonians developed sophisticated systems for organizing, cataloging, and preserving written materials. They created educational curricula that could transmit complex knowledge across generations. They established professional standards for scholarship that ensured the accuracy and reliability of their work. The integration of theoretical knowledge with practical application was another distinctive feature of Babylonian scholarship. Their mathematical work was closely connected to engineering projects. Their astronomical observations were used for both calendar making and navigation. Their medical knowledge was applied to actual patient care rather than remaining purely theoretical. The collaborative nature of Babylonian scholarship was also remarkable. Scholars worked together on long-term projects, sharing data and methods across different specialties. They built on each other's work rather than competing for individual credit. This collaborative approach allowed them to tackle complex problems that no individual scholar could have solved alone. The influence of Babylonian scholarship extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Traveling scholars carried Babylonian mathematical and astronomical techniques to Egypt, Greece, India, and other centers of learning. The standards they established for systematic observation, careful record keeping, and logical reasoning became fundamental principles of scientific method. While we often think of ancient civilizations as isolated, Babylon was actually the center of the world's first global economy. Babylonian merchants, diplomats, and travelers created networks that connected cultures from India to Egypt, spreading not just goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic styles across the known world. Imagine standing at the gates of Babylon around 1500 BCE and watching the constant stream of travelers arriving from distant lands. Caravans from Anatolia bring silver, copper, and precious stones. Merchants from the Indus Valley carry exotic spices, cotton textiles, and ivory. Egyptian traders offer gold, papyrus, and fine crafted goods. Each group brings not just products, but news, stories, and innovations from their home regions. The Babylonians didn't just participate in this trade, they organized and systematized it. They developed standardized weights and measures that were accepted across vast distances. They created legal frameworks for international commerce, including the world's first known commercial law codes. They established merchant houses with branches in multiple cities, allowing for credit transfers and complex financial arrangements that wouldn't be out of place in a modern economy. The goods that flowed through Babylon reveal the sophistication of these trade networks. Archaeological sites have yielded lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, silk from China, and ivory from Africa. These weren't just luxury goods for the elite. Middle-class Babylonian families owned objects made from materials that had traveled thousands of miles to reach them. But the real innovation was in the financial systems that made this trade possible. Babylonian merchants developed some of the world's first banking institutions, complete with interest-bearing loans, letters of credit, and investment partnerships. They created insurance systems to protect against the risks of long-distance travel. They even developed futures contracts allowing farmers to sell crops before they were harvested and merchants to secure supplies before they were transported. The mathematical sophistication required for these financial innovations was enormous. Calculating compound interest, risk premiums, and exchange rates required advanced mathematical techniques that were developed by Babylonian scholars and then applied by merchants throughout the ancient world. This economic sophistication had profound cultural effects. Babylon became incredibly cosmopolitan, with permanent communities of foreign merchants, diplomats, and scholars. The city's temples served travelers from dozens of different religious traditions. Its schools taught multiple languages and cultural practices. Its legal system had to accommodate different customs and expectations. The diplomatic networks that grew out of these trade relationships were equally sophisticated. Babylonian kings maintained embassies in distant capitals and exchanged ambassadors with rulers from India to Egypt. The correspondence between these rulers, preserved on clay tablets, reveals complex negotiations over trade agreements, military alliances, and cultural exchanges. Perhaps most remarkably, these diplomatic relationships led to the world's first known international treaties and legal frameworks. The Babylonians helped develop concepts of diplomatic immunity, territorial sovereignty, and international law that are still fundamental to modern international relations. The technological exchanges that occurred through these trade networks were equally important. Innovations in metallurgy, agriculture, textiles, and other technologies spread rapidly throughout the region through Babylonian trade connections. This cross-cultural exchange of ideas accelerated technological development and helped spread beneficial innovations to communities that might otherwise have remained isolated. The linguistic influences were also significant. Akkadian, the language of Babylon, became the diplomatic language of the ancient Middle East, serving a function similar to that of Latin in medieval Europe or English in the modern world. Babylonian scribes developed the writing systems and diplomatic protocols that facilitated communication between different cultures and kingdoms. The artistic and cultural exchanges were equally remarkable. Babylonian artistic styles influenced crafts production throughout the region, while foreign artistic traditions enriched Babylonian culture. Religious ideas, literary works, and cultural practices spread through these trade networks, creating a cosmopolitan culture that drew on traditions from across the known world. The scale of these trade operations was extraordinary. Individual merchant houses might have operations spanning thousands of miles, with permanent representatives in dozens of cities. The coordination required to manage such far-flung operations demanded sophisticated communication systems, standardized accounting practices, and reliable methods for transferring value across vast distances. The risk management strategies developed by Babylonian merchants were equally sophisticated. They diversified their investments across multiple trade routes and product categories. They developed insurance systems to protect against losses from piracy, natural disasters, and political upheavals. They created legal mechanisms for resolving disputes that might arise between parties from different cultures and legal traditions. The social impacts of this global trade were profound. Babylonian society became increasingly diverse and cosmopolitan. Foreign communities established their own quarters within the city, bringing their languages, customs, and traditions. Intermarriage between different ethnic groups was common, creating a multicultural society that was remarkably tolerant for its time. The economic benefits of this trade were enormous. Babylon became one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world, able to support large populations, massive construction projects, and sophisticated cultural institutions. The wealth generated by trade provided the resources necessary for the scientific, artistic, and architectural achievements that made Babylonian civilization famous. But perhaps most importantly, these trade networks helped spread the innovations of Babylonian civilization throughout the ancient world. Legal concepts, mathematical techniques, astronomical knowledge, and engineering practices developed in Babylon, were carried by merchants and diplomats to distant lands, influencing the development of civilizations across 3 continents. Amidst all this engineering, commerce, and scholarship, the Babylonians also created one of history's first great artistic and literary traditions. Their epic poems, religious ceremonies, and artistic achievements reveal a people deeply concerned with questions that still occupy human minds today. What is the meaning of life? How should we treat each other? What is our relationship to the divine? The Epic of Gilgamesh, possibly humanity's oldest surviving work of literature, emerged from this culture. It's not just an adventure story. It's a profound meditation on friendship, mortality, and the human condition. The fact that Babylonian scribes preserved and copied this epic for over 1,000 years shows how deeply it resonated with their understanding of human experience. The story itself reflects distinctly Babylonian values, the importance of urban civilization, the value of loyal friendship, the necessity of accepting mortality, and the idea that humans achieve immortality through their lasting achievements rather than personal survival. These themes weren't accidental. They reflected the worldview of a civilization that had learned to build lasting institutions while accepting the reality of individual and even civilizational mortality. Babylonian religious ceremonies were elaborate, theatrical events that involved entire communities. The New Year festival, which lasted for days, included dramatic reenactments of creation myths, public readings of important texts, and collective rituals that reinforced social bonds and cultural values. These weren't just religious observances, they were educational and cultural events that helped transmit knowledge and values across generations. The visual arts produced by Babylonian craftsmen were remarkable for their technical sophistication and artistic vision. Bronze working reached levels of precision that wouldn't be surpassed for centuries. Glazed ceramics created in Babylon influenced pottery traditions throughout the ancient world, and the architectural decorations of temples and palaces demonstrated an aesthetic sense that balanced grandeur with human-scale beauty. But perhaps most impressive was their approach to preserving and transmitting culture. The library systems developed by Babylonian scholars were the first systematic attempts to collect, organize, and preserve human knowledge. They understood that culture was fragile, that knowledge could be lost, and that each generation had a responsibility to preserve and build upon the achievements of their predecessors. This cultural consciousness influenced everything about Babylonian society. Education was valued not just for its practical benefits, but because knowledge and learning were seen as essential to human dignity. Artistic achievement was supported not just by elite patrons, but by communities that understood the importance of beauty and creativity to human flourishing. The literary traditions established by Babylonian writers influenced storytelling throughout the ancient world. The narrative techniques, themes, and character types that appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh can be traced through later Greek, Roman, and biblical literature. The idea that literature should address fundamental questions about human existence and meaning became a standard expectation for serious literary works. The artistic techniques developed by Babylonian craftsmen were equally influential. Their methods for working with bronze, creating glazed ceramics, and decorating architectural surfaces were copied and adapted throughout the ancient world. The aesthetic principles they developed, balancing symmetry with variation, combining functional and decorative elements, creating works that were both beautiful and meaningful, continue to influence artistic practice today. The musical traditions of Babylon were also sophisticated and influential. Archaeological evidence reveals a variety of instruments, from stringed lyres and harps to wind instruments and percussion. Musical notation systems allowed for the preservation and transmission of specific compositions. Music was integrated into religious ceremonies, court entertainment, and popular culture. The integration of different art forms was another distinctive feature of Babylonian culture. Literary works were often accompanied by musical performances, Religious ceremonies combined poetry, music, dance, and visual art. Architectural projects incorporated sculpture, painting, and decorative arts. This holistic approach to artistic expression created rich, multi-sensory cultural experiences. The philosophical and religious ideas expressed through Babylonian art and literature were equally sophisticated. They grappled with fundamental questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the relationship between humans and the divine. Their answers weren't simplistic. They acknowledged the complexity and ambiguity of human existence while maintaining faith in the possibility of meaningful life. The patronage systems that supported Babylonian artists and writers were remarkably inclusive. While wealthy individuals and institutions certainly supported major artistic projects, there were also community-based systems that allowed ordinary citizens to participate in cultural creation. This democratic approach to cultural patronage helped ensure that artistic traditions remained connected to popular values and concerns. The preservation of artistic and literary works was taken as seriously as the preservation of practical knowledge. Temples and palaces maintained libraries that included not only administrative records, but also literary works, musical compositions, and artistic designs. Professional scribes specialized in copying and preserving cultural materials, ensuring their transmission to future generations. The influence of Babylonian artistic and literary traditions extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Traveling performers, merchants, and diplomats carried stories, songs, and artistic techniques to distant lands. The themes and techniques pioneered by Babylonian artists influenced cultural development throughout the ancient world and continue to shape artistic traditions today. The foundation of Babylonian civilization was agriculture, but this wasn't simple farming. It was a sophisticated science that involved understanding soil chemistry, plant biology, hydrology, and ecology. The Babylonians developed agricultural techniques that sustained large populations for over 1,000 years while maintaining soil fertility and preventing environmental degradation. The challenge was enormous. The climate of Mesopotamia was hot and dry, with irregular rainfall and extreme seasonal variations. The soil, while fertile when properly managed, was prone to salinization if irrigated incorrectly. The rivers that provided water were unpredictable, sometimes flooding catastrophically and sometimes dropping to dangerously low levels. Yet the Babylonians not only fed their large urban populations, but also produced surpluses for trade. They accomplished this through a combination of technological innovation, scientific observation, and careful resource management that would be impressive even by modern standards. The irrigation systems we discussed earlier were just one part of a comprehensive agricultural strategy. The Babylonians also developed sophisticated crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility while maximizing yields. They understood that different crops depleted and restored different nutrients in the soil, and they planned multi-year rotations that kept their fields productive indefinitely. They were among the first people to practice systematic plant breeding, carefully selecting seeds from the most productive plants to improve crop varieties over time. Archaeological evidence shows that Babylonian grains were significantly more productive than their wild ancestors, the result of centuries of careful selective breeding. The Babylonians also developed integrated pest management systems that controlled harmful insects and diseases without damaging crops or soil. They used beneficial insects to control pests, planted companion crops that deterred harmful organisms, and developed botanical pesticides from local plants. Their understanding of soil science was remarkably advanced. They knew how to test soil acidity, measure nutrient levels, and determine the appropriate treatments for different soil conditions. They developed organic fertilizers from animal waste, plant materials, and mineral deposits that improved soil structure and fertility. The agricultural calendar followed by Babylonian farmers was based on careful astronomical observations and detailed record-keeping. They tracked weather patterns, flood cycles, and seasonal variations over decades, allowing them to predict optimal planting and harvesting times with remarkable accuracy. Agricultural education was systematic and thorough. Young farmers learned not just practical techniques, but also the scientific principles underlying successful agriculture. This knowledge was preserved in written form and transmitted through formal and informal educational systems. The integration of agriculture with other economic activities was also sophisticated. Farmers weren't just food producers. They also grew crops for textiles, construction materials, and trade goods. They raised livestock that provided not only food, but also labor, transportation, and raw materials for manufacturing. The social organization of agriculture was equally advanced. Farmers formed cooperative groups that shared labor, equipment, and knowledge. They established mutual aid societies that provided support during difficult periods. They created marketing cooperatives that gave them better bargaining power in trade negotiations. The environmental consciousness of Babylonian agriculture was remarkable for its time. They understood that agricultural practices had long-term environmental consequences and planned accordingly. They developed sustainable techniques that maintained productivity while preserving natural resources for future generations. The diversity of crops grown by Babylonian farmers was extraordinary. They cultivated dozens of different varieties of grains, vegetables, fruits, and other plants. This diversity provided protection against crop failures, ensured nutritional variety, and supported specialized agricultural products for trade. The livestock management practices developed by Babylonian farmers were equally sophisticated. They bred improved varieties of cattle, sheep, goats, and other animals. They developed feeding systems that maximized animal productivity while minimizing resource consumption. They created integrated systems where animal waste fertilized crops and crop residues fed animals. The food preservation and storage techniques developed by Babylonian farmers allowed them to maintain food security through difficult periods. They developed methods for drying, fermenting, and otherwise preserving foods that could last for years if necessary. They built storage facilities that protected food supplies from pests, moisture, and other threats. The agricultural innovations developed by Babylonian farmers influenced farming practices throughout the ancient world. Their techniques were copied and adapted by neighboring civilizations and spread through trade networks to distant lands. Many of the basic principles they established continue to guide agricultural practice today. The Babylonians developed one of the world's first comprehensive healthcare systems, combining empirical medical knowledge with sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and disease. Their medical achievements were remarkable, not just for their time, but by any standard, representing a scientific approach to healing that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. Babylonian physicians understood that disease had natural causes, rather than being purely supernatural phenomena. While they certainly believed that gods could influence health, they also recognized that many illnesses resulted from physical factors like diet, environment, hygiene, and injury. This dual approach allowed them to develop both practical treatments and spiritual therapies. The medical knowledge preserved in Babylonian libraries is extensive and sophisticated. Medical texts describe hundreds of diseases, their symptoms, and recommended treatments. These weren't just theoretical discussions, they were practical guides based on centuries of clinical observation and experience. Babylonian doctors could perform complex surgical procedures, including cataract removal, kidney stone extraction, and even brain surgery. Archaeological evidence shows that they had sophisticated surgical instruments and understood principles of sterilization and wound care. Surgical success rates were remarkably high, suggesting advanced technical skills and medical knowledge. The pharmaceutical knowledge of Babylonian physicians was equally impressive. They identified and used hundreds of medicinal plants, minerals, and animal products. They understood concepts like dosage, drug interactions, and treatment duration. They even developed some of the world's first medical compounds, combining multiple ingredients to create more effective treatments. The diagnostic techniques used by Babylonian doctors were remarkably sophisticated. They understood how to take pulse, examine urine, and observe other physical signs of disease. They kept detailed patient records that allowed them to track the progression of illnesses and evaluate the effectiveness of different treatments. Medical education in Babylon was systematic and thorough. Aspiring physicians underwent years of training that included both theoretical study and practical experience. They learned anatomy through direct observation, studied pharmacology through hands-on preparation of medicines, and developed surgical skills through supervised practice. The organization of medical practice was also advanced. There were medical specialists who focused on particular types of diseases or treatments. There were medical schools that preserved and transmitted knowledge. There were professional standards that regulated the practice of medicine and ensured quality care. Public health measures developed by the Babylonians were equally impressive. They understood the importance of clean water, proper sanitation, and disease prevention. They implemented public health policies that reduced the spread of infectious diseases and improved overall population health. The integration of medicine with other fields of knowledge was another distinctive feature of Babylonian healthcare. Medical practitioners often had training in astronomy, mathematics, and other sciences. This interdisciplinary approach allowed them to develop more sophisticated understanding of human health and disease. The psychological aspects of healthcare were also well understood by Babylonian physicians. They recognized that mental and emotional factors could influence physical health. They developed treatments that address both physical symptoms and psychological well-being. Women played important roles in Babylonian healthcare. There were female physicians who specialized in gynecology and pediatrics. There were midwives who provided obstetric care. There were healers who specialized in herbal medicine and traditional remedies. The medical ethics developed by Babylonian physicians were sophisticated and influential. They understood concepts like patient confidentiality, informed consent, and professional responsibility. The Code of Hammurabi included specific laws governing medical practice and establishing standards for physician conduct. The hospital systems developed in Babylon were among the world's first. Temples often served as medical centers where patients could receive treatment and care. These institutions had organized medical staffs, systematic treatment protocols, and facilities designed specifically for healthcare. The influence of Babylonian medicine extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Medical knowledge and techniques were transmitted through trade networks and diplomatic contacts to neighboring civilizations. Many of the fundamental principles of medical practice established by Babylonian physicians continue to influence healthcare today. The documentation of medical knowledge was taken as seriously as other forms of scholarship. Medical texts were carefully preserved and copied, ensuring that knowledge accumulated over generations rather than being lost when individual physicians died. This systematic approach to medical education and knowledge preservation sets standards that remain important in medical practice today. The role of women in Babylonian society was complex and varied, but remarkably progressive compared to many other ancient civilizations. Women had significant legal rights, economic opportunities, and social influence that would seem advanced even by modern standards in some parts of the world. Babylonian women could own property independently of their husbands or fathers. They could buy and sell real estate, engage in business transactions, and accumulate wealth in their own right. Archaeological records show many examples of women who were successful merchants, property owners, and even moneylenders. Marriage in Babylonian society was typically arranged, but wives had significant legal protections and rights within marriage. Marriage contracts were detailed legal documents that specified the rights and responsibilities of both spouses. Women could initiate divorce proceedings under certain circumstances, and were entitled to financial support if the marriage ended. The legal system provided strong protections for women against abuse and exploitation. Husbands who mistreated their wives could face legal penalties. Women could testify in court and serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. They could even represent themselves in legal matters or hire advocates to represent their interests. Educational opportunities for women varied by social class, but literacy was not uncommon among upper-class women. Some women became scribes, a profession that required extensive education and carried significant social prestige. Others became priestesses, roles that required not only literacy, but also extensive knowledge of religious and ceremonial traditions. Women in religious roles held considerable power and influence. High priestesses were among the most important figures in Babylonian society, responsible for major temples and their associated economic enterprises. Some priestesses controlled vast wealth and commanded large staffs of subordinates. The economic roles played by women were diverse and important. In addition to their household responsibilities, many women were involved in textile production, food processing, brewing, and other commercial activities. Some women operated their own businesses or worked as partners in family enterprises. Motherhood was highly valued in Babylonian society, but it wasn't the only path to respect and influence for women. Childless women could still achieve high status through their professional achievements, religious roles, or business success. Women who chose not to marry or who remained childless weren't automatically marginalized. Healthcare for women was surprisingly advanced. There were female physicians who specialized in women's health issues. Midwifery was a respected profession with its own training systems and professional standards. Medical texts show sophisticated understanding of reproductive health and pregnancy-related medical issues. The legal rights of mothers were also well protected. Mothers had rights regarding their children's inheritance, education, and marriage arrangements. In some cases, mothers could serve as guardians for their children if their husbands died, maintaining control over family property and business interests. Women's participation in religious life was extensive and important. In addition to serving as priestesses, women participated in religious festivals, sponsored temple activities, and played key roles in household religious observances. Some religious roles were exclusively female, giving women areas of spiritual authority that were recognized and respected. The diversity of women's experiences in Babylonian society was considerable. Wealthy women had opportunities and freedoms that were denied to poorer women. Urban women generally had more options than rural women. But even within these constraints, the legal and social framework provided more opportunities for women's advancement than existed in many other ancient societies. Family structures in Babylon were typically extended rather than nuclear. Households often included grandparents, unmarried siblings, and other relatives. This created support networks that benefited women by providing assistance with childcare, household management, and economic activities. The inheritance laws that governed family property were generally favorable to women. Daughters could inherit property from their fathers, wives could inherit from their husbands, and mothers could pass property to their children. These inheritance rights gave women economic security and independence that wasn't available in many other ancient societies. The social expectations placed on women were significant but not overwhelming. Women were expected to manage households efficiently, raise children successfully, and support their husbands' careers. But they were also expected to be economically productive, socially engaged, and intellectually capable. The influence of Babylonian family structures and women's roles extended throughout the ancient world. The legal protections, economic opportunities, and social recognition accorded to women in Babylonian society influenced the development of family law and women's rights in neighboring civilizations. Despite their reputation for peaceful commercial and cultural achievements, the Babylonians also developed sophisticated military systems that protected their civilization and projected their power throughout the region. Their approach to warfare combined technological innovation, strategic thinking, and organizational excellence. The Babylonian military was primarily defensive in nature, designed to protect the homeland rather than conduct aggressive conquest. This reflected the geographic reality of Mesopotamia, a wealthy region surrounded by less prosperous neighbors who might be tempted to raid or invade. The military's primary mission was deterrence and defense. The organization of Babylonian forces was remarkably sophisticated. There were professional soldiers who served as the core of the army, supplemented by citizen militias drawn from the urban population. Military service was seen as a civic duty, and even wealthy merchants and craftsmen were expected to serve when needed. The technological innovations developed by Babylonian military engineers were significant. They were among the first to use iron weapons and armor effectively. They developed improved siege engines, including early catapults and battering rams. They created sophisticated fortification systems that could withstand prolonged attacks. The strategic thinking that guided Babylonian military planning was advanced for its time. Military leaders understood concepts like combined arms tactics, strategic reserves, and defensive depth. They developed contingency plans for different types of threats and maintained intelligence networks that provided early warning of potential attacks. The logistical systems that supported Babylonian military operations were equally impressive. They could rapidly mobilize and supply large forces, maintain communication across vast distances, and coordinate complex military operations. These capabilities required sophisticated planning and administrative systems. The integration of military and civilian activities was a distinctive feature of Babylonian defense. The same engineers who built irrigation canals also designed fortifications. The same organizational systems that managed trade networks also coordinated military logistics. This integration made the entire society more resilient and effective. The fortification systems built by the Babylonians were among the most advanced in the ancient world. The walls of Babylon itself were massive and sophisticated, incorporating multiple defensive layers, advanced gate systems, and innovative architectural features that maximized defensive effectiveness. The naval forces developed by the Babylonians were primarily defensive, but also supported trade and communication. They built and operated fleets of river vessels that could patrol waterways, transport troops, and support amphibious operations when necessary. The diplomatic and intelligence systems that supported Babylonian defense were as important as their military forces. They maintained extensive networks of alliances and treaties that deterred potential enemies. They gathered intelligence about neighboring powers and potential threats. They used diplomacy to resolve conflicts peacefully when possible. The training systems that prepared Babylonian soldiers were systematic and thorough. Military education included not only weapons training and tactical instruction, but also engineering, mathematics, and other technical skills. Officers received advanced education that prepared them for complex command responsibilities. The veteran care systems developed by the Babylonians were advanced for their time. Soldiers who were wounded in service received medical care and financial support. Veterans were given preference for government positions and other employment opportunities. Families of soldiers killed in action received pensions and other assistance. The influence of Babylonian military innovations extended throughout the ancient world. Their weapons, tactics, and organizational methods were copied and adapted by neighboring civilizations. The strategic principles they developed influenced military thinking for centuries. The balance between military preparedness and civilian prosperity was carefully maintained in Babylonian society. While they invested significantly in defense, they avoided the militarization that characterized some other ancient societies. The military served the state rather than dominating it. The religious and philosophical traditions of Babylon were sophisticated and influential, providing not only spiritual guidance, but also intellectual frameworks that shaped their understanding of the universe, human nature, and social responsibility. Their approach to these fundamental questions was both practical and profound. Babylonian religion was polytheistic, but organized around a clear hierarchy of gods, with specific areas of responsibility. Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, was seen as the king of the gods, but other deities controlled different aspects of life: agriculture, war, love, wisdom, and so forth. This system provided a comprehensive framework for understanding and approaching all aspects of existence. The creation myths and cosmological beliefs of the Babylonians were remarkably sophisticated. The Enuma Elish, their primary creation epic, describes the formation of the universe through conflict and cooperation among divine forces. This wasn't just storytelling, it was a philosophical framework for understanding the nature of existence and the human place within it. The concept of divine justice was central to Babylonian religious thought. They believed that the gods were concerned with human behavior and would reward righteousness while punishing wrongdoing. This belief system provided moral guidance and social stability while encouraging ethical behavior. The relationship between humans and gods was seen as reciprocal rather than purely hierarchical. While humans owed respect and service to the gods also had responsibilities toward humans. This mutual obligation created a moral framework that influenced law, ethics, and social organization. Babylonian temples were not just religious centers, but also intellectual and cultural institutions. They maintained libraries, schools, and workshops where knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The priests who served in these temples were often scholars and scientists and artists, as well as religious leaders. The philosophical traditions that emerged from Babylonian religious thought addressed fundamental questions about human existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, explores themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning that remains central to human experience today. The ethical systems developed by Babylonian thinkers were sophisticated and practical. They understood that moral behavior required not just individual virtue, but also social institutions that encouraged and rewarded ethical conduct. This understanding influenced their legal systems, educational practices, and cultural traditions. The concept of wisdom in Babylonian thought was comprehensive, encompassing not just intellectual knowledge, but also practical skills, ethical understanding, and spiritual insight. Wisdom was seen as the highest human achievement, more valuable than wealth, power, or fame. The integration of religious and secular knowledge was a distinctive feature of Babylonian intellectual life. They didn't see science and religion as conflicting, but as complementary approaches to understanding reality. This integration allowed them to develop sophisticated knowledge while maintaining spiritual depth. The practices of Babylonian religion were elaborate and meaningful. Religious festivals were community events that reinforced social bonds and cultural values. Personal devotional practices provided individuals with spiritual guidance and comfort. Ritual activities connected daily life with cosmic significance. The prophetic traditions that emerged from Babylonian religion emphasized social justice and moral responsibility. Religious leaders often spoke out against corruption, inequality, and other social problems. They saw religious faith as requiring active engagement with social and political issues. The eschatological beliefs of the Babylonians, their ideas about death and afterlife, were complex and varied. While they believed in some form of survival after death, they placed greater emphasis on achieving lasting significance through earthly achievements and moral conduct. The influence of Babylonian religious and philosophical traditions extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Their ideas about divine justice, human responsibility, and cosmic order influenced the development of later religious traditions, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The scholarly traditions that preserved and developed Babylonian religious thought were sophisticated and systematic. Religious texts were carefully studied, interpreted, and transmitted. Theological debates were conducted through formal scholarly methods. Religious knowledge was integrated with other forms of learning. The tolerance and inclusiveness of Babylonian religious practice was remarkable for its time. While they had their own distinctive traditions, they also incorporated elements from other cultures and allowed foreign communities to maintain their own religious practices. This religious pluralism contributed to Babylon's cosmopolitan character. The economic systems that sustained Babylonian urban civilization were remarkably complex and sophisticated, involving innovations in finance, trade, manufacturing, and resource allocation that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries. Understanding these economic achievements helps explain how Babylon became one of history's first great cities. The basis of Babylonian urban economy was agricultural surplus generated by their advanced farming techniques and irrigation systems. This surplus allowed significant portions of the population to engage in non-agricultural activities, crafts, trade, administration, education, and other specialized occupations that defined urban civilization. The craft production systems developed by Babylonian artisans were highly organized and efficient. Craftsmen specialized in particular products and techniques, achieving levels of skill and quality that made their goods sought after throughout the known world. Guild systems regulated quality, trained apprentices, and maintained professional standards. The trading systems that connected Babylon to distant markets were sophisticated and far-reaching. Babylonian merchants developed standardized contracts, credit systems, and quality controls that facilitated long-distance trade. They established permanent trading posts in distant cities and maintained business relationships that spanned generations. The financial innovations developed by Babylonian merchants were particularly advanced. They created banking systems that could transfer funds across vast distances without moving physical currency. They developed insurance systems that protected against the risks of long-distance trade. They even created early forms of corporate organization that allowed multiple investors to share the risks and profits of large ventures. The monetary systems used in Babylon were sophisticated and stable. While barter was still common for local transactions, standardized units of silver served as currency for larger transactions. The weight and purity of silver were carefully regulated, creating a reliable medium of exchange that was accepted throughout the region. The labor systems that supported Babylonian economic activity were complex and varied. There were free wage laborers, indentured servants, and slaves, but the economy wasn't primarily based on slave labor. Most workers were free citizens who could negotiate their wages and working conditions within the constraints of guild systems and legal regulations. The manufacturing systems developed by Babylonian craftsmen were remarkably efficient. They used division of labor, standardized tools and techniques, and quality control systems that allowed them to produce goods in quantities sufficient for both local consumption and export trade. The resource allocation systems that distributed goods and services throughout Babylonian society were sophisticated and generally fair. Market mechanisms determined most prices, but there were also government regulations that prevented exploitation and ensured that essential goods remained affordable for ordinary citizens. The taxation systems that funded government activities were complex but not oppressive. Taxes were collected in both goods and labor, with rates varying according to ability to pay. Tax revenues funded public works projects, military defense, religious activities, and administrative operations. The investment systems that channeled resources into productive activities were advanced for their time. Wealthy individuals and institutions invested in trade ventures, manufacturing enterprises, and agricultural improvements. These investments created employment opportunities and generated economic growth that benefited the entire society. The accounting systems used by Babylonian businesses and institutions were remarkably sophisticated. They maintained detailed records of transactions, inventories, and financial positions. These accounting practices allowed for effective business management and provided the data necessary for economic planning. The property rights systems that governed ownership of land, buildings, and other assets were well defined and legally protected. Property could be bought, sold, and inherited according to established legal procedures. These secure property rights encouraged investment and economic development. The contract systems that governed business relationships were detailed and enforceable. Contracts specified the rights and responsibilities of all parties, included provisions for dispute resolution, and were backed by legal enforcement mechanisms. This contractual framework reduced transaction costs and encouraged complex business relationships. The quality control systems that maintained standards for goods and services were comprehensive and effective. Guild systems established quality standards. Government inspectors monitored compliance, and legal remedies were available for consumers who received substandard goods or services. The innovation systems that encouraged technological and organizational improvements were robust and effective. Successful innovations were quickly adopted and adapted throughout the economy. Knowledge about new techniques and technologies was systematically preserved and transmitted. The economic integration that connected different sectors of the Babylonian economy was remarkable. Agriculture, manufacturing, trade, and services were all interconnected through complex networks of supply and demand. This integration created efficiencies and redundancies that made the entire economic system more resilient and productive. All great civilizations eventually faced decline, and Babylon was no exception. But the story of Babylonian decline is also the story of how achievements can outlast the civilizations that created them, influencing future cultures in ways their creators never imagined. The decline came gradually, the result of multiple factors rather than any single catastrophe. Environmental changes made the irrigation systems harder to maintain. Political instability weakened the social cooperation that had made the civilization possible. New military technologies gave advantages to nomadic peoples who had previously been unable to challenge urban civilizations. But perhaps most significantly, the very success of Babylonian innovations made them targets for conquest by neighbors who had learned Babylonian techniques but hadn't inherited Babylonian restraints. The Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks, who conquered Babylon, were often less interested in preserving its civilization than in exploiting its wealth and strategic position. The environmental challenges that contributed to Babylonian decline were particularly significant. Climate change reduced rainfall in the region, making irrigation more difficult and less reliable. Soil salinization, caused by centuries of intensive irrigation, reduced agricultural productivity. Siltation of canals and rivers required increasingly expensive maintenance efforts. The political instability that weakened Babylonian society had multiple causes. Succession disputes weakened royal authority. Foreign invasions disrupted trade networks and economic activities. Internal conflicts between different social groups reduced the cooperation necessary for maintaining complex urban systems. The military challenges faced by later Babylonian rulers were increasingly difficult to meet. New weapons and tactics developed by neighboring peoples gave them military advantages. The costs of defense consumed increasing portions of government resources. The professional military became increasingly separated from civilian society. The economic pressures that strained Babylonian resources were considerable. Competition from other trading centers reduced Babylon's commercial advantages. The costs of maintaining infrastructure grew as systems aged and required more frequent repairs. Population pressures strained food production and urban services. Yet the ideas, techniques, and cultural achievements of Babylon didn't die with its political independence. Babylonian mathematics and astronomy were preserved and developed by Persian and Greek scholars. Babylonian legal concepts influenced Roman law and eventually European legal traditions. Babylonian architectural techniques spread throughout the ancient world and can still be seen in modern construction. The scribal traditions that had preserved Babylonian knowledge for over a millennium continued under foreign rule, ensuring that libraries were maintained and texts were copied. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, he was so impressed by its scholarly traditions that he ordered its libraries to be preserved and its scholars to be supported. This cultural continuity meant that Babylonian achievements became part of the foundation of later civilizations. The mathematics that made possible Greek geometry and Roman engineering had Babylonian roots. The astronomical observations that guided medieval Islamic science came from Babylonian star charts. Even the alphabet you're reading these words in can trace its ancestry back to writing systems developed in ancient Mesopotamia. But perhaps the most important Babylonian legacy was the idea that human beings could work together to create something greater than any individual could achieve alone. The concept of civilization itself, organized, cooperative urban life based on law, knowledge, and mutual responsibility, was pioneered by the Babylonians and passed down through every subsequent culture. The administrative systems developed by Babylonian governments became models for later empires. The Persian Empire, which conquered Babylon, adopted many Babylonian administrative practices and extended them throughout their vast territories. The Romans similarly incorporated Babylonian-derived administrative techniques into their governmental systems. The educational traditions established by Babylonian schools influenced learning throughout the ancient world. The curriculum they developed, the teaching methods they used, and the scholarly standards they maintained became templates for educational institutions in many different cultures. The scientific methods pioneered by Babylonian scholars, systematic observation, careful record-keeping, logical analysis, and collaborative research, became fundamental principles of intellectual inquiry that continue to guide scientific work today. The artistic and literary traditions established by Babylonian creators influenced cultural development throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The themes they explored, the techniques they developed, and the standards they established continue to inspire artists and writers for centuries after the fall of Babylon itself. The technological innovations created by Babylonian engineers and craftsmen spread throughout the ancient world and provided the foundation for later technological developments. From hydraulic engineering to metallurgy, from textile production to construction techniques, Babylonian innovations continued to influence technological progress long after their civilization had ended. The commercial and financial systems developed by Babylonian merchants became the basis for trade and banking throughout the ancient world. The legal frameworks they created for international commerce, the financial instruments they developed, and the business practices they established continue to facilitate economic activity across cultural boundaries. The legal principles established by Babylonian lawmakers influenced jurisprudence throughout the ancient world and continue to shape legal systems today. The idea that law should be written, public, and applied equally to all citizens. The concept that evidence should be carefully evaluated before reaching judgments. The principle that punishments should be proportionate to crimes. All of these fundamental concepts of modern justice can be traced back to ancient Babylon. The urban planning techniques developed by Babylonian city builders influenced the design of cities throughout the ancient world. The grid systems they used, the integration of public and private spaces they achieved, and the infrastructure systems they created became models for urban development that continue to influence city planning today. The religious and philosophical ideas that emerged from Babylonian culture influenced the development of later religious and philosophical traditions. Concepts about divine justice, human responsibility, and cosmic order that were first articulated in Babylon continue to evolve and develop in later cultures, eventually contributing to the formation of major world religions. To truly understand what made Babylonian civilization remarkable, we need to experience the daily rhythms of life in this ancient city, the routines, relationships, and rituals that filled ordinary days reveal how thousands of people learned to live together in humanity's first great urban experiment. The day begins before dawn, when the air is still cool and the streets are quiet. This is the most pleasant time to work in the Mesopotamian climate, so families throughout the city are stirring while the stars are still visible. From windows and doorways comes the soft sound of the morning prayers, the quiet conversations of families planning their day, and the gentle sounds of fires being kindled for the morning meal. The houses themselves are marvels of practical design, adapted to both climate and urban living. Built around central courtyards that provide light and air circulation, these homes are typically 2 or 3 stories tall, with thick mud brick walls that provide insulation against the heat. The ground floor often houses workshops or storage areas, while Asua's upper floors are reserved for family living spaces. As the sun rises, the streets begin to fill with people heading to work. The city's grid system, with its wide main avenues and narrower side streets, efficiently channels this daily migration. Workers, merchants, students, and administrators all move purposefully through the urban landscape, their destinations as varied as their occupations. The neighborhood bakeries are among the first businesses to open, filling the air with the aroma of fresh bread. These community ovens serve entire districts, with families bringing their prepared dough to be baked by professional bakers. This system is efficient, social, and reduces the fire hazard that would come with individual ovens in every home. The marketplaces come alive with merchants setting up their stalls and arranging their goods. The diversity is extraordinary. Local farmers with fresh produce, traveling traders with exotic goods from distant lands, craftsmen displaying their latest creations, and service providers offering everything from letter writing to shoe repair. The guild workshops begin their daily activities, with master craftsmen directing apprentices and journeymen in the production of goods that will be sold both locally and exported throughout the known world. The sounds of hammers on metal, looms clicking rhythmically, and potters' wheels spinning create the industrial symphony of the ancient city. The administrative centers of the city fill with scribes, officials, and citizens conducting business. Legal disputes are heard and resolved. Contracts are written and witnessed. Taxes are collected and recorded. The bureaucratic apparatus that keeps the complex urban society functioning operates with remarkable efficiency and fairness. The schools welcome students who will spend their days learning reading, writing, mathematics, and other skills essential for urban life. Education is valued not just for its practical benefits, but as a mark of civilization itself. Literacy rates in Babylon are higher than in many parts of the world even today. The temples serve multiple functions as centers of worship, education, economic activity, and community gathering. Priests conduct religious ceremonies, but they also teach classes, manage economic enterprises, and provide social services. The integration of spiritual and practical activities reflects the holistic worldview of Babylonian culture. As the day progresses and the heat intensifies, the pace of activity slows. Many people retreat to the shade of their courtyards or workshops, taking advantage of the natural cooling provided by their architectural design. This isn't laziness. It's adaptation to climate that allows for sustained productivity over long periods. The afternoon brings different rhythms as the heat begins to subside. Trade activities resume, social visits are made, and community activities take place. The city's public spaces, plazas, temple courtyards, and market areas fill with people conducting business, socializing, and simply enjoying the company of their neighbours. Evening is a time for family and community gathering. The extended families that form the basic units of Babylonian society come together for meals, conversation, and shared activities. Grandparents tell stories, parents discuss the day's events, and children play games that have been passed down through generations. The night brings its own activities and rhythms. While most people rest, some continue working, bakers preparing for the morning rush, guards patrolling the streets, astronomers observing the stars. The city never completely sleeps, but it does become quieter and more peaceful. Religious observances mark the passage of time throughout the day. Morning prayers acknowledge the dawn. Midday rituals mark the sun's zenith, and evening ceremonies honor the coming night. These regular observances provide spiritual rhythm and community synchronization that help maintain social cohesion. The seasonal rhythms of urban life are closely connected to the agricultural calendar that sustains the city. Planting and harvest times affect food availability and prices. Flood seasons require special preparations and may disrupt normal activities. Religious festivals mark important transitions in the yearly cycle. The life stages of individuals are marked by community rituals and celebrations. Birth, coming of age, marriage, and death are all occasions for community gathering and mutual support. These life cycle celebrations reinforce social bonds and transmit cultural values across generations. The integration of public and private life is a distinctive feature of Babylonian urban culture. While families have private spaces within their homes, much of daily life takes place in public or semi-public areas. This creates a sense of community involvement and mutual responsibility that helps maintain social stability. The balance between individual achievement and community responsibility is carefully maintained in Babylonian society. People are encouraged to develop their talents and pursue their goals, but always within a framework of social cooperation and mutual support. The rhythms of daily life in Babylon create patterns of meaning and purpose that sustain individuals and communities through both good times and challenges. These patterns, established over centuries of urban living, provide the stability and continuity that allow civilization to flourish. The governmental systems that ruled Babylonian society were sophisticated experiments in organizing human cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Understanding how they managed to govern thousands of people peacefully and effectively provides insights into the fundamental challenges of political organization that remain relevant today. The Babylonian concept of kingship was complex, combining practical administrative authority with religious legitimacy and personal charisma. Kings weren't just military commanders or hereditary rulers. They were seen as stewards of divine order, responsible for maintaining justice, prosperity, and social harmony. The administrative systems that carried out royal decisions were remarkably sophisticated. There were specialized departments for different governmental functions: tax collection, military organization, public works, legal administration, and foreign relations. Each department had its own hierarchy of officials, standardized procedures, and accountability mechanisms. The legal framework that governed Babylonian society was comprehensive and systematic. Laws covered everything from major crimes to minor commercial disputes, from family relationships to property rights. Legal procedures were clearly defined, and there were multiple levels of courts to handle different types of cases. The civil service that staffed Babylonian government was professional and merit-based. Officials were selected based on their education, experience, and competence, rather than solely on family connections or political loyalty. This created a stable and effective administrative apparatus that could function regardless of political changes. The tax systems that funded governmental activities were sophisticated and generally fair. Taxes were collected in both goods and labor, with rates varying according to ability to pay. Tax revenues were used to fund public works, military defense, religious activities, and administrative operations that benefited the entire community. The public works programs undertaken by Babylonian governments were massive and beneficial. The construction and maintenance of irrigation systems, roads, bridges, temples, and defensive fortifications required enormous coordination and resources. These projects provided employment, improved living conditions, and demonstrated governmental competence. The diplomatic relations maintained by Babylonian rulers were complex and far-reaching. They negotiated treaties, exchanged ambassadors, and maintained peaceful relations with neighboring powers whenever possible. When conflicts arose, they often sought diplomatic solutions before resorting to military action. The military organization that defended Babylonian territory was professional and effective. The army combined citizen soldiers with professional troops, defensive strategies with offensive capabilities. Military leaders were trained in strategy, tactics, and logistics, ensuring effective defense of the realm. The intelligence systems that provided information about foreign threats and domestic challenges were sophisticated and comprehensive. Government officials maintained networks of informants, analyzed reports from travelers and merchants, and used diplomatic contacts to gather intelligence about potential problems. The communication systems that connected different parts of the Babylonian realm were efficient and reliable. Official messengers carried government communications along established routes. Standardized writing systems and administrative procedures ensured that messages were accurately transmitted and understood. The record-keeping systems that documented governmental activities were meticulous and comprehensive. Official records were maintained for tax collection, legal proceedings, military operations, and diplomatic relations. These records provided the information necessary for effective governance and planning. The accountability mechanisms that prevented abuse of power were multiple and effective. Officials were subject to oversight by their superiors, legal challenges from citizens, and regular audits of their activities. Corruption was punished severely, and honest service was rewarded. The succession systems that ensured continuity of leadership were generally stable and predictable. While succession disputes occasionally occurred, the governmental apparatus usually continued functioning effectively during transitions. Professional administrators provided continuity regardless of changes in royal leadership. The balance between central authority and local autonomy was carefully maintained. While the royal government set overall policies and standards, local communities retained significant control over their own affairs. This balance has allowed for effective coordination while preserving local initiative and responsibility. The integration of governmental and religious authority was complex but generally effective. Religious leaders provided moral guidance and legitimacy for governmental actions, while secular officials handled practical administrative tasks. This partnership helped maintain social stability and popular support. The responsiveness of Babylonian government to citizen needs and concerns was remarkable for its time. There were formal procedures for petitioning authorities, legal remedies for government abuses, and regular opportunities for public input on important decisions. The long-term planning capabilities of Babylonian government were impressive. Officials thought in terms of decades and generations rather than just immediate needs. This long-term perspective enabled massive infrastructure projects and sustained policies that benefited society over extended periods. The adaptability of Babylonian governmental systems allowed them to respond effectively to changing circumstances. When faced with new challenges, environmental changes, foreign threats, economic disruptions, the government could modify its policies and procedures without losing effectiveness or legitimacy. The commercial networks that connected Babylon to the wider world were among the most sophisticated achievements of ancient civilization. Understanding these trade systems reveals how economic cooperation across cultural boundaries created prosperity and spread innovations throughout the ancient world. The geographic advantages that made Babylon a natural trading center were considerable. Located at the intersection of major river and land routes, the city could serve as a hub for trade between distant regions. Goods traveling between India and Egypt, between Anatolia and the Persian Gulf, naturally passed through Babylonian territory. The standardization efforts that facilitated trade were comprehensive and influential. Babylonian merchants developed uniform weights and measures that were accepted across vast distances. They established quality standards for different types of goods. They created standardized contracts and business practices that reduced transaction costs and facilitated complex commercial relationships. The financial innovations that made long-distance trade possible were remarkable for their sophistication. Babylonian merchants developed credit systems that allowed traders to finance expeditions without carrying large amounts of physical currency. They created insurance systems that protected against the risks of long-distance travel. They even developed early forms of banking that could transfer funds across great distances. The transportation systems that moved goods throughout the trading network were efficient and reliable. Rivers were the primary highways for bulk goods, with standardized boats and professional crews. Overland routes were maintained and protected, with caravanserais providing rest and resupply points for traveling merchants. The communication systems that coordinated trade activities were sophisticated and far-reaching. Merchants maintained correspondence with business partners in distant cities. Market information was systematically collected and disseminated. Business intelligence about conditions in distant markets influenced local trading decisions. The legal frameworks that governed international trade were comprehensive and enforceable. Commercial law codes established rights and responsibilities for different types of business relationships. Dispute resolution mechanisms allowed for fair settlement of conflicts between parties from different cultures and legal traditions. The cultural exchanges that occurred through trade were as important as the economic transactions. Merchants carried not just goods, but ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and cultural practices. These exchanges enriched all the cultures that participated in the trading networks. The technological transfers that occurred through trade accelerated innovation throughout the region. New techniques for manufacturing, agriculture, and construction spread rapidly through commercial contacts. Technological improvements in one region quickly benefited people throughout the trading network. The linguistic developments that facilitated trade were significant and lasting. Akkadian became the diplomatic and commercial language of the ancient Middle East, serving a function similar to English in the modern global economy. Standardized terminology and business vocabulary made communication easier across cultural boundaries. The diplomatic relations that supported trade were carefully maintained and protected. Trading relationships often led to formal diplomatic ties between different kingdoms and city-states. Commercial disputes were resolved through diplomatic channels whenever possible, preserving the relationships that made trade profitable. The urban development that resulted from trade was remarkable throughout the region. Cities grew larger and more sophisticated as trade brought wealth and cultural exchange. Urban planning, architecture, and public amenities improved as communities competed to attract and serve traveling merchants. The social mobility that trade created was significant and widespread. Successful merchants could achieve wealth and status regardless of their birth circumstances. Trade created opportunities for talented individuals to advance economically and socially, contributing to social dynamism and innovation. The risk management strategies developed by Babylonian traders were sophisticated and effective. They diversified their investments across multiple trade routes and product categories. They developed partnerships and alliances that shared risks and resources. They created contingency plans for dealing with various types of disruptions. The market intelligence systems that informed trading decisions were comprehensive and accurate. Merchants systematically gathered information about supply and demand conditions in different markets. They tracked political and economic developments that might affect trade. They shared information with trusted partners while protecting sensitive business intelligence. The quality control systems that maintained product standards were strict and effective. Guild systems established quality standards for manufactured goods. Inspection procedures ensured that exported goods met established standards. Reputation mechanisms encouraged honest dealing and punished fraud or deception. The seasonal rhythms that governed trade activities were well understood and systematically accommodated. Trade routes and schedules were planned around weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and religious festivals. Storage and inventory systems allowed merchants to take advantage of seasonal price variations. The scale of these trading operations was enormous by ancient standards. Individual merchant houses might have operations spanning thousands of miles and involving hundreds of employees. The volume of goods moving through Babylonian markets was sufficient to influence economic conditions throughout the region. The legacy of these trading systems extended far beyond ancient times. The roots, relationships, and institutions created by Babylonian merchants provided the foundation for later commercial developments. Many of the principles and practices they established continue to influence international trade today. The intellectual achievements of Babylonian scholars were among the most remarkable accomplishments of ancient civilization. Their systematic approach to understanding the natural world, their mathematical innovations, and their commitment to preserving and transmitting knowledge created foundations for scientific and scholarly work that continue to influence intellectual development today. The astronomical observations conducted by Babylonian scholars were more accurate and systematic than anything achieved elsewhere in the ancient world. Using careful naked-eye observations from temple rooftops and other elevated positions, they tracked the movements of stars, planets, and other celestial phenomena with remarkable precision. The mathematical techniques developed by Babylonian scholars were sophisticated and influential. They created the sexagesimal number system, base 60, that we still use for measuring time and angles. They developed algebraic methods for solving complex equations. They calculated areas, volumes, and other geometric properties with impressive accuracy. The record-keeping systems that preserved scholarly knowledge were comprehensive and systematic. Thousands of clay tablets containing mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and other scientific information have been preserved in Babylonian libraries. These records show a commitment to accumulating knowledge over long periods of time. The educational systems that transmitted scholarly knowledge were well organized and effective. Schools trained students not just in practical skills, but in theoretical knowledge and research methods. The curriculum included mathematics, astronomy, literature, history, and other subjects that provided broad intellectual foundation. The collaborative approaches that characterized Babylonian scholarship were advanced for their time. Scholars worked together on long-term projects, sharing observations and calculations. They built on each other's work rather than competing for individual credit. This collaborative approach allowed them to tackle complex problems that no individual could have solved alone. The practical applications of scholarly knowledge were systematic and beneficial. Mathematical techniques were used in engineering projects, business calculations, and legal proceedings. Astronomical observations were applied to calendar making, navigation, and agricultural planning. Medical knowledge was used to improve healthcare and treat diseases. The preservation efforts that maintained scholarly libraries were meticulous and effective. Professional scribes specialized in copying and preserving important texts. Library systems organized and cataloged materials for easy access. Backup copies were made of important works to ensure their survival. The international exchanges that spread scholarly knowledge were extensive and beneficial. Babylonian scholars corresponded with colleagues in other countries. Students traveled from distant lands to study in Babylonian schools. Scholarly works were translated into other languages and transmitted to foreign libraries. The quality control systems that maintained scholarly standards were rigorous and effective. Calculations were checked and verified by multiple scholars. Observations were repeated and confirmed. Errors were corrected, and improved methods were developed. This attention to accuracy ensured the reliability of Babylonian scholarship. The integration of different fields of knowledge was a distinctive strength of Babylonian scholarship. Mathematical techniques were applied to astronomical problems. Medical knowledge incorporated insights from natural philosophy. Engineering projects utilized both practical skills and theoretical understanding. The long-term perspective that characterized Babylonian scholarship was remarkable for its time. Scholars understood that knowledge accumulated over generations and that their work would be used by future researchers. This perspective encouraged careful documentation and systematic research methods. The philosophical approaches that guided Babylonian scholarship were sophisticated and influential. They believed that the natural world followed rational principles that could be understood through careful observation and logical analysis. This belief in the intelligibility of nature provided the foundation for scientific inquiry. The technological innovations that resulted from scholarly research were numerous and important. Improved mathematical techniques enabled better engineering calculations. More accurate astronomical observations led to better calendars and navigation methods. Medical research resulted in more effective treatments and surgical procedures. The cultural impacts of Babylonian scholarship were profound and lasting. The intellectual traditions they established influenced the development of science and scholarship throughout the ancient world. Their commitment to rational inquiry and systematic research became fundamental principles of intellectual work. The institutional frameworks that supported scholarly work were well developed and sustainable. Libraries, schools, and research centers were maintained over long periods. Professional positions for scholars ensured that intellectual work could be pursued as a career. Funding systems provided resources for long-term research projects. The democratic aspects of Babylonian scholarship were remarkable for their time. While most scholars came from privileged backgrounds, intellectual achievement was valued regardless of social origin. Knowledge was seen as a common heritage that should be preserved and transmitted for the benefit of all humanity. The legacy of Babylonian scholarship extended far beyond the end of their civilization. Their mathematical techniques, astronomical observations, and research methods were preserved and developed by later cultures. Many of the fundamental principles of scientific method that we use today can be traced back to innovations first developed by Babylonian scholars. As our long journey through ancient Babylon draws to a close, let the gentle crackling of the fire remind you that you're safe, warm, and connected to a human story that stretches back over 4,000 years. The achievements we've explored tonight, engineering marvels, legal systems, scientific discoveries, artistic creations, commercial networks, and systems of governance, were all accomplished by people who faced challenges not so different from those we face today. They figured out how to live together in large groups, sharing resources and responsibilities. They learned to build for the future while dealing with immediate crises. They created systems of knowledge that could survive individual lifetimes and continue growing across generations. They developed technologies that improved human life while dealing with the unintended consequences of those technologies. Perhaps, most importantly, they demonstrated that human civilization is not inevitable or automatic. It requires conscious effort, cooperation, and the willingness to learn from both successes and failures. The Babylonians succeeded not because they were perfect, but because they were persistent, adaptive, and committed to building something lasting. The daily rhythms of life we explored, the morning prayers and market activities, the afternoon work and evening gatherings, the seasonal festivals and life cycle celebrations created patterns of meaning and community that sustained individuals and families through both prosperity and hardship. These patterns show us that civilization is not just about impressive monuments or technological achievements, but about finding ways for people to live together meaningfully and peacefully. The systems of governance we examined, the balance between authority and freedom, the integration of practical administration with moral leadership, the mechanisms for ensuring accountability and preventing abuse of power, addressed fundamental challenges of political organization that remain relevant today. The Babylonians showed that effective government requires not just power, but wisdom, not just efficiency, but justice. The economic systems we studied, the integration of local production with international trade, the development of financial instruments that facilitated complex transactions, the creation of markets that were both free and fair, demonstrated that prosperity requires both individual initiative and social cooperation. The Babylonians understood that economic success depends not just on material resources, but on trust, honesty, and mutual benefit. The intellectual achievements we explored, the mathematical innovations, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and scholarly methods, showed how systematic inquiry and collaborative research can unlock the secrets of the natural world. The Babylonians established principles of scientific method and scholarly integrity that continue to guide intellectual work today. The cultural and artistic achievements we examined, the literary works that explored fundamental questions about human existence, the artistic traditions that expressed beauty and meaning, the educational systems that transmitted knowledge across generations, revealed a people deeply concerned with the full range of human experience. They understood that civilization requires not just material prosperity, but cultural richness. The resilience and adaptability we observed, their ability to survive natural disasters, recover from political upheavals, and adapt to changing circumstances, demonstrated that sustainable civilization requires not just strength but flexibility, not just planning, but the ability to respond creatively to unexpected challenges. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let your mind rest with these ancient builders, engineers, scholars, artists, merchants, and citizens who looked at a flood-prone marsh between two rivers and saw the possibility of paradise. They built the first great cities with nothing but human hands and brilliant minds. They survived disasters that would have destroyed less organized societies. They created art, literature, and knowledge that still influences us today. Their cities are dust now, their towers fallen, their canals silted up. But their ideas live on in every law we follow, every building we raise, every problem we solve through cooperation rather than conflict. They proved that human beings can indeed touch the heavens, not by building towers, but by building civilizations that outlast any individual life. Rest now, knowing that you are part of this same human story, this same ongoing effort to build something worthy of our highest aspirations. The fire burns warm beside you, the night is peaceful around you, and the ancient builders of Babylon would recognize you as kindred spirits, humans who dare to dream of touching the sky. The lessons they learned about cooperation, innovation, resilience, and hope remain as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago. In a world that often seems chaotic and divided, their example reminds us that humans have successfully built complex, peaceful, prosperous societies before. If they could do it with bronze tools and clay tablets, perhaps we can do even better with our modern advantages. Their understanding that civilization is fragile and must be constantly tended, that knowledge must be preserved and transmitted, that cooperation is more powerful than conflict, that innovation must be balanced with wisdom. These insights are their gifts to us across the centuries. Sweet dreams, fellow builder. Tomorrow brings new towers to raise, new problems to solve, new ways to prove that human cooperation can indeed work miracles. But tonight, rest in the warmth of knowing that your ancestors in ancient Babylon lit the first fires of civilization, and that flame still burns in every human heart that dreams of building something beautiful, lasting, and true. The waters of the Tigris and Euphrates still flow, though their courses have changed. The land between the rivers still supports human life, though the cities have different names. And somewhere in the dust of Mesopotamia, the foundations of humanity's first great urban experiment still rest beneath the earth, waiting to remind future archaeologists that once, long ago, humans dared to dream of paradise and succeeded in building something very close to it. May your dreams tonight be filled with the same hope, courage, and determination that drove those ancient builders. May you wake tomorrow, ready to contribute your own chapter to the ongoing human story of civilization, cooperation, and the endless quest to make the world a little more beautiful, a little more just, and a little more worthy of our highest aspirations. The fire fades to gentle crackling, then soft silence. The story of Babylon is complete, but the story of human civilization continues. Rest well and dream of towers that touch the sky.